Hello there and welcome to my paint guide for the Zombicide Rio Z Janeiro add-on pack. This is part 2, this is the second set of survivors. This is Ney, MC Jordim and Stephen. As you can see, what I did was sprayed all three models with some matte white spray from Colourforge. Starting with MC Jordim, I'm going to paint his shorts with some Screamer Pink. This will then be followed up with a wash of Drucci Violet. While that wash dries, we'll move on to Ney and we're going to paint his socks and his shirt with Macragge Blue. These areas will then be given a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade. And while that wash dries, we'll move on to Stephen and paint his shorts with some Thunderhawk Blue. He'll then receive a very, very thin coat of Drakenhof Nightshade. As that paint dries, we'll move back to MC and we will use Screamer Pink just to relayer what we've previously painted, avoiding any recesses. Then we're going to mix in some Pink Horror to the Screamer Pink, so we've got about a 70-30 ratio towards the Screamer Pink and very gently highlight all the areas. MC has some chevrons running down the sides of his shorts, so we're going to start working on those using some Avalanche Sunset to very carefully draw the line down. This will be highlighted with some Flash Gits Yellow. And then Abaddon Black will be used to mark in the black lines. Next we'll use Moot Green to paint the tops and the bottoms of his shorts. And this will then be edge highlighted with a mix of Moot Green and Matte White for about a 50-50 split. Now we're going to move to Ney and we're going to relayer the blue with some Macragge Blue. Then do a 50-50 mix of Calgar Blue and Macragge Blue. Then a 30-70 mix of Macragge Blue and Calgar Blue for the final highlight. With his shirt out of the way, we'll begin his shorts. We'll start that with some Grey Sear, followed by a 50-50 mix of Grey Sear and Matte White. Then a 30-70 mix of Grey Sear and Matte White. Until finally Matte White just by itself. He also has a badge on his shirt that needs to be painted as well. The outer edge and the inner circle are both matte white. He also has a number 7 on the front of his shirt, so we'll very carefully mark that out while we still have the white out. The rest of his badge is yellow, so we're going to use Avalanche Sunset to mark in the first details. And these will then get a very small highlight with some Flash Gits Yellow. We'll then move back to Stephen and we'll relayer that Thunderhawk Blue, making sure we avoid any recesses. A little bit of Rust Grey was added to the Thunderhawk Blue for about a 70-30 split in favour of Thunderhawk Blue for the first highlight. More Rust Grey was added to that mix, so we've got a 50-50 mix, and that's for the final highlight. Stephen also has a pattern on his shorts, so we're going to use some Avalanche Sunset to draw both the vertical and horizontal lines. Be very careful with this. If you do make a mistake though, just use the previous mix to correct any errors. We'll then start painting his shirt with some Stegodon Scale Green. This will probably need a couple of coats. Next, we'll use some Corella Green Shade to shade the entire shirt. I then mix some Stegodon Stale Green with some Matte White for a 70-30 mix to start the first highlight. followed by a 50-50 mix of matte white and Stegodon Stale Green for the second. Now, next I use some Skarsnik green to draw in the palm trees that are on Stephen's shirt. Try and take your time with this bit and try and be as careful as possible. Now the majority of the clothing is out of the way, I'm going to work on the pouches and things like that. I'm going to use Mornfang Brown for Stephen's bum bag and his travel case. And I'm also going to use it on Ney's hip holster. I'm then going to use Balor Brown to paint in Ney's backpack. And for MC's, I'm going to use some Talon Sand. At this point, I also thought I'd start MC's gun, so I use Mornfang Brown for the darker parts, and Balor Brown for the lighter. The only parts we're painting at the moment are the stock and the grips. And everything we just painted received a wash of Agrak's Earthshade. Once that had dried, I went back and painted everything in the same order. So starting with Stephen, I painted on some Mornfang Brown just to tidy up all the wash. I then did a 50-50 mix of Scrag Brown and Mornfang Brown for the first layer of highlights, followed by Skag Brown just by itself for the second. I then reapplied Balor Brown to Ney's backpack, and then added some matte white to the mix for a 50-50 ratio for the highlight. I then reapplied the Talon Sand on MC's pouches, followed by a 50-50 mix of Talon Sand and matte white for the highlights. Next, I used Bugman's Glow to start painting everyone's skin. And then I followed that up with a wash of Reichland Flesh Shade. After the wash is dried, we're then going to move back to Bugman's Glow and relayer everything, making sure we ignore the recesses. Before we go any further, I'm going to paint the eyes of Ney using Abaddon Black, then some matte white, which we'll also use to paint his teeth and the teeth in on MC as well. And then finally a small dot of Abaddon Black for the pupil. Now going back to the skin, I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Bugman's Glow for the first layer highlight. Then Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself for the second, and the bulk of the actual colour. And then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh for the final highlight on MC and Ney. With Stephen though, his skin is a little bit lighter, so we're going to use Kislev Flesh just by itself for one final highlight. Now it's time to start work on all those fiddly details. So the first thing we'll do is use Abaddon Black to start etching in his lanyard, his glasses, the phone on his hip. On Ney, there's a tiny little clasp that needs to be painted on his rucksack. And I'm also going to paint his football boots black as well. Then I'm going to use Iron Hand Steel to paint the guns for both Ney and Stephen. We'll also start working on smaller details such as the zippers on both the bags of Stephen and Ney, the lanyard chain on Stephen, the little buttons on MC's pouches, and finally one of MC's chains is also silver, so we'll paint that in now as well. And everything we've just painted black or silver will get a coat of Nuln Oil. Then I'll start painting in the gold with some Retributor armor. I'll start with Stephen's watch, then all the jewelry on MC, and we'll also paint MC's gun as well. All of this will then receive a wash with Reichland Flesh Shade. After the Nuln Oil is dry, I'll use some Eshin Grey to paint in the highlights on all of the black. And then I'll use Stormhost Silver to paint in the highlights on all the silver areas. I'm then going to use a tiny bit of Bestigor Flesh just to mark the screen on the mobile phone. And then I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Grey to paint in some diagonal lines on Stephen's sunglasses. All the gold will then get highlighted with Ulrich Armour Gold. I'm then going to use Dryad Bark to paint in Stephen's sandals and his hair and the grips of his and Ney's guns. All of this will then get a wash of Agrac's Earthshade. I'm then going to use Grey Sear to paint in some details on Ney's boots, as well as MC's and Stephen's socks. All of those areas will then get highlighted with some matte white. I'll also use that white to paint in the face of Stephen's watch, and the buttons on his mobile phone. I'm then going to use Sarabite Green to paint in MC's shoes. These will then get washed with some Corella Green shade. Once that was dry, I did a 50-50 mix of Sarabite Green and matte white for the one and only highlight. I then used Screamer Pink to pick out the details on his shoes, such as the bottoms of his shoes and his laces. That was then mixed with some matte white for a 50-50 ratio to do the one and only highlight. Next, we're going to paint those tassels on his shoes with some Armour & Blue, which we'll then highlight with some Temple Guard Blue. I'm then going to use Wild Rider Red to paint in the lenses of his sunglasses. I'm then going to move back to Ney and start on the zombie head that he's kicking about. I'm going to coat it with some Rakarth flesh, which will then be given a wash of Reichland flesh shade. And while that dries, I'm going to use some Iron Warriors to pick out the little studs on his football boots. Then I'm going to move to Stephen and I'm going to start painting his hat with Thunderhawk Blue. It's just the peak and the first sort of triangle with the bobble on top. I'll then mix in some matte white to give it a 50-50 split to do its one and only highlight. I'll use Grey Sear to paint the rest of the cap, which will then be highlighted with some matte white. Now the wash on the zombie head should be dry, so we can use some Flayed One flesh to start highlighting all its features. And then I'll use a tiny bit of Caribou Crimson to highlight the areas such as eyes and the back of the neck where the head has been decapitated. Once that dries, I'm going to use some Screamer Pink to layer in some gore and viscera from where the head section has been removed. And then I'm going to use some Pallid Witch flesh to paint in the eye and the teeth. I'm then going to use Wraithbone to paint both Ney's and MC's hair. At this stage, I'm also going to use some Wraithbone to paint in MC's eyebrows as well. Both sets of hair will then be given a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. These next two steps you can skip if you wish. I'm going to use a tiny little, very thinned down Abaddon Black to put some detailing in on Stephen's lanyard. And I'm also going to paint in the hands on his watch as well. I'm then going to use a tiny bit of matte white to paint a couple of dots on both his sunglasses and MC's. Now it's just basically time for the bases, so I'm going to use some Dawnstone Grey to paint in the bases of all three miniatures. This will then be stippled with some Corvus Black, followed up by some Grey Sear. I'll then use some Corvus Black to paint in cracks in the concrete. Next, I'll use some Abaddon Black to paint the rims of the bases. And then I'll wash the base with some watered down Agrac's Earthshade. Once the wash was dry, I then applied some anti-shine matte varnish all over the models just to help them protect them while they're in their cases. I then applied some blood for the blood god, dragging away from the severed head that Ney is kicking. Finally, if you wish, MC does have quite a lot of tattoos on there. I don't really have any tips for that, apart from if you are going to try and emulate them, take your time, use a nice thin brush, go slowly, and don't be afraid of making any mistakes. You can always tidy up if you do. And with that, that's the second wave of survivors for Rio Z Janeiro finished. They're quite interesting models. They've got quite a lot of detail on there. Quite a lot of freehand work, which of course you can always completely skip if you don't feel confident or you don't really want to go through all that hard work and, quite frankly, fiddly detail. Overall, that took about 8 hours to complete and were an absolute joy to paint. If you use this guide, I hope it's helped you. I hope you've learned a little bit, and I hope you think about subscribing, giving the video a thumbs up, and goodbye for now.